Money has become one of the most effective political weapons used by political parties and politicians to contest and win elections in Africa. Governments are the source of big-ticket deals and are thus targeted by all manner of private businessmen and economic hitmen. The World Bank estimates that 70% of public spending in Africa is channeled through public procurement. Increasingly, companies and corporations have tended to bankroll prospective political parties and candidates during elections in anticipation that when they win public office, they return the favor. Professor Pielo Lumumba at one time referred to African leaders as tenderpreneurs because they peddle influence into the public procurement process with a view of determining who wins the next public contract. Africa today is undergoing what some political commentators have called Chinization, where Chinese companies have flocked the continent, winning contracts such as expressway constructions, standard gauge railways, airports, stadiums, power generation dams, oil, and many others. It remains to be established how much these Chinese companies contribute to political parties and candidates to ensure their best interests are protected. What we know, however, is that they bankroll them big time. In this month's webinar series, we take a detour into the manifestation of public procurement corruption and how proceeds from the same find their way into financing politics and elections in Africa.
Welcome to the 7th webinar series on money in politics. My name is Abel Eseru and I will be the host of today's webinar. Today we shall have a discussion on public procurement, corruption and political finance in Africa. This webinar is brought to you by Alliance for Finance Monitoring, a political finance watchdog in Africa. Before I proceed to introduce our panelists, I would like all of us who are watching from wherever we are to hit that subscription button of our YouTube channel, and also those who are following us on Facebook, kindly like our Facebook page, but also those who are watching directly from LinkedIn, like our LinkedIn page. We have 5 panelists joining us from different countries. They will be sharing with us their perspectives on the topic based on how things transpire in their respective countries. Allow me to introduce these gallant ladies and gentlemen. I will start with Mr. Kizito Tithani from Malawi. He is the Executive Director of Center for Multi-Party Democracy in Malawi. He is an inter-party dialogue facilitator who has worked in the area of democracy and governance for close to 20 years. He has spent the last 15 years working exclusively with political parties. Before getting involved with work in the political arena, Tithani worked in the area of social justice and human rights. His other interests are in voice and accountability elections and the interface between politics and development. Tithani holds a degree in public administration from University of Malawi and a master's degree in public administration and development from University of Witwatersrand. The next panelist is Miss Harriet Wachira from Kenya. Currently, she works as a programs coordinator on policy, legal, and institutional framework at Transparency International Kenya. She has over 14 years experience in social research, with 7 years specific to governance and anti-corruption in Kenya and East Africa. She also sits in the technical committee of Open Government Partnership Kenya and leads the implementation of the commitment on beneficial ownership transparency. She holds a Bachelor's of Education arts degree from the University of Nairobi. Harriet, you're welcome. Our next panelist is Mr. Arome Ageni from Nigeria. He is a governance and development professional and a graduate of history and a researcher. He is committed to advancing African development and work to promote pro-African development policies and initiatives. Arome Agenye is the head of research and policy and also is currently executive director of Center for Research Development in Africa, a research and policy think tank based in Nigeria. Then we shall also be joined by Miss Morapedi Husetso from Botswana. She is the founding secretary of Botswana Center for Public Integrity. She is currently working as the director of PLAFT South Africa, the platform which protects whistleblowers in Africa and also seeks to defend whistleblowers as well as strategically litigate and advocate on their behalf where their disclosure speaks to the public interest of African citizens. She has spearheaded the establishment of South African Anti-Corruption Network, and she also seeks to campaign for a corruption-free and prosperous SADC region. She has studied for a master's in politics and international relations. She has a postgraduate diploma in international studies and a bachelor's degree in humanities from Rhodes University and University of Botswana, respectively. Then, lastly, we shall be joined by Honorable Stephen Muchitale from Uganda. He has served as Bulisa County Member of Parliament for 15 years. While in Parliament, he served as a chairman, National Economic Committee. He also served as chairman, Parliamentary Pension Board, member, Board Committee on Public Accounts Committee, Defense and Internal Affairs. He is the founding member of Parliamentary Forum on Oil and Gas. He is an economist and political scientist. Mr. Muchitale, you're welcome. And I will start with you. You have been in this arena for so long and you understand how public procurement, corruption, and political finance have been interfacing. From your own perspective, we do know that recent reports from Africa have revealed that there are so much trends whereby money is being spent by political parties and some of that money comes from public procurement. From your own angle and your own understanding, can you give us a brief overview on this topic?
Thank you so much, Akfim, and thank you, fellow panelists. It's nice being on this month's webinar. More so to discuss such an intriguing subject when we are talking of about 60 years post-independence for those countries like Uganda and those who, at the time when Osage Nkrumah said Africa must unite, and yet Africa is not united. We are talking of the free trade for the continent of Africa, and it's still sounding far-fetched. So even when we talk about procurement, the first point I want to anchor is that we are not doing the intra-Africa trade. Even when we are doing procurement, largely we are procuring from we are being supplied by the developed in quotes from Europe, from China, from America. They are the ones supplying us, Africa. So it's very unfortunate. How I wish we are talking about procuring. I thank the Nigerian banks and South African banks and the telecoms who at least have some African supplies within this. I would rather be supplied by Nigeria, be supplied by South Africa, because I know the wealth will remain within Africa and possibly one day by osmosis it will reach us. But unfortunately, we are procuring from outside. And I'm also a procurement practitioner. 15 years before I came to Parliament, 15 years in Parliament, and that's my 30 years of practice. I want to say from the onset that 70% of our corruption is related to procurement, and 70% of our budget is expended in procurement direction. And that's why it's very important to understand. And I'm starting with the state of affairs, that 60 years after independence, our African countries are still balkanized into our colonial boundaries. And therefore, we are lacking the interconnection. We are lacking the big opportunity of us working as Africa, not at least if it was regions, and you talk of SADC, you talk of the East African Community, you talk of ECOWAS, it would be proper if we have an interconnection of pipeline, the reason why even now Russia has been very important is because of that interconnection. So I want us to break this balkanization. If we are going to talk of a procurement which is of essence in terms of local content, in terms of industrialization, in terms of import substitution, would require to break the colonial boundaries by interconnection of the grid power lines, of the oil, of the gas, trade within ourselves, so that when we are talking of procurement, we are talking about trade within ourselves. That should be the point I would want to hammer most importantly. And because 60 years after Sarajevo said Africa must unite, when Gaddafi tried to make an attempt, you know what happened? So it's our biggest challenge. We are basically the political class of Africa, both the elite, both the political and the politicians and the bureaucrats have betrayed Africa. They have largely been working as agents in collusion with the multinationals. So basically, all the procurements we're talking about, the power retention of our politicians, our political parties, they just want to get money to continue being supplied by the international hegemonies as they get little commission to finance their power retention projects, as opposed to having a deliberate industrial policy to say, for us in East African community, the members of ECOWAS, the members of SADC, when we are doing the interconnections of roads, when we are the corridors, if we are doing the standard gauge rail, you negotiate it as a Great Lakes East Africa, now joined by South Sudan and DRC. And therefore, you're going to reduce, first of all, you have a bigger mileage to make, you have bulk negotiation. I'm now speaking as somebody from a procurement background. You negotiate bulk, you have a big component of local content, and make sure that you reduce discretion. Corruption also goes with discretion. The moment each state house becomes a clearing house, standard gauge Uganda, standard gauge Kenya, standard gauge, then corruption is just at play. But if you reduce it to a Great Lakes project, even the oil and gas pipelines we are talking about, the refineries, you have the economies of scale you enjoy as a region. We have, for example, a net import substitution for oil. If we are to, but pass to a Ugandan refinery, the same oil companies will go tomorrow to Sudan, negotiate with Sudan alone, negotiate with DRC, and therefore allowing the economic hitmen working for those multinationals in the north, delaying our development agenda, delaying our local content, delaying our industrialization process. I would like to address this matter from that angle, that until we reduce under this sovereignty, claiming that each country is sovereign, you enjoy your small kingdom in your balkanized country, yet we are missing out on big opportunities. Whether it is going to be supplies of pharmaceuticals, if we agree as SADC, if we agree as ECOWAS, if we agree as Horn of Africa, if we agree as East Africa, and say we're going to put one giant pharmaceutical, and we put our money together, we reduce this business of people in Europe, people in China, people in India, people in America, finding their way to each state house and getting clearance. The matter is even more complicated when it comes to loans. We now have loans which come with contractors. We have loans which are having the pre-finance on. These loans are commercial, they are not concessional, and then they come at a very high rate. On top of that, they come with a contractor. That means there is an agent in the government. The elite are already getting some commission to make sure that we are choking with this debt, we are choking with this where there is no competition. You will hear of direct procurement, you will hear of classified procurement. So all those are avenues of making sure that money, contracts are given abroad, and money does not come to our local content, to our local companies, and in a way, the ones profiteering is the money which they need for power retention, for their campaign strategy, And I think to continue handling it from one country is not proper, and that's why I want to thank this webinar, which looks at Africa. Africa must unite, and it's possible if we did interconnections, if we did have Africa working together into joint venture projects, negotiate with China, negotiate with Exim Bank China, negotiate as a region of Africa, and discuss the whole kilometer of road corridor, the whole pipeline, discuss the dams together. The Inga of DRC is still stuck because we see it as a DRC project. It should be the Great Lakes project. Until we do that, we shall continue serving the interest of the developed North, and our political leaders and the bureaucrats are going to continue serving those interests at the expense of Africa.
Thank you, Honorable Mutale. I want now to hear from our other colleagues from other countries. I will start with you, our sister from Botswana. There is anecdotal information connecting corruption in the public procurement with how political parties and candidates raise their campaign money. From where you are, can you paint us a picture on how issues in how political parties and candidates and how the procurement processes are done, and whether there is a linkage between how money stolen from procurement ends up in financing political parties in Botswana or candidates?
All right. Good afternoon, colleagues and panelists, and thank you for your invitation. To speak of this issue in 5 minutes, I am going to try and do that. But as I was looking at the topic and researching for the topic for the discussion this afternoon, I thought I'd go back to the history of political parties in Botswana and how they've financed their politics and how they've financed their different parties over time, and how the issue of corruption really came onto the table in Botswana as a problem. And this really began in the early 90s. And I think the DCEC, the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crimes, was established after those incidents that took place with the corruption in the in the Botswana Housing Corporation, that looked at the operations of the corporation and how the general manager would give housing or would give housing to certain people in the country who were in the elite. It also looked at the corruption in land allocation and the supplies or procurement of school teaching materials, and how the different ministers or assistant ministers, and even touching to the president then relatives were involved in the corruption or in the mismanagement of public assets and public finances. But at the center of that, all these stories led to commissions of inquiry, and the reporting highlighted the role of our politicians who were in the cabinet in that mismanagement, and how at the center of it you'd have ministers giving directives for general managers to give land, or general manager to give housing to someone in the elite, or how the land board would be directed to give land, even though citizens were on a waiting list for years, and you have someone skipping the queue to be given preferential treatment, or how a company without experience in supplying educational material was given a multi-million procurement contract to provide supplying of school teaching materials, and how that lost the country and the people millions of money, and I guess young people an opportunity to really learn. But at the center of that, you see the role played by the ministers and the permanent secretaries, and when you look closely and closer, you definitely see that these are political elites, and that in some way or form, in some ways, there's a reason why the executive would allow their peers to be given those contracts, because they actually belong to the same party, the same ruling party. And one has to ask, but what will be the benefit of doing that? Who benefits more? And if you look at, one can actually see the issue of shadow campaigning or shadow campaign financing, and that you give contracts to your own party members, usually members of the cabinet, or associates to the members of the cabinet, because you do know that somewhere, somehow, indirectly, that money will go back into politics, and that money will go back into financing politics or financing the political party. If we take the contract between the Botswana government and the De Beers, and obviously the Botswana government, we're talking about the ruling party here and the political party, and the allegations that annually, I don't know if it's still happening, that annually, the De Beers would give the ruling party close to $1 billion pula. And in a way, you go into how, politicians give contracts, procurement contracts to certain companies, so that eventually those companies can transfer the money back into politics and into financing their political parties and their campaigns. And so I looked at that and I thought it would be good to actually really go back into in the history of corruption in Botswana, and how at the center of it, the politically influential and politically exposed persons are, play a role in financing their parties. But it kind of makes sense, right? When you look at the fact that political parties aren't profit-making, and when you look at the fact that they are not really regulated, you have registry of societies that don't really enforce, the different provisions of the Societies Act in ensuring that political parties, make their returns annually, and when it comes to campaigning, that they really stick to if we take the Botswana example, the maximum that a candidate can actually use to campaign is 50,000 pula, which is really little, because that's $5,000. But we have seen, the ruling party, for example, even the opposition, driving, going around the country in helicopters, the ruling party using, 3-liter diesel Toyota to pick up people, like 50 of them. And when you look closely, you see the fact that the treasurer of the ruling party is actually a businessman who owns a car dealership, and he donated, or at least loaned, those cars to the party during, to campaign and just before elections. So in a way, sometimes it's not even money, but it is the resources that are availed by private, private sector or private interests for their own interests. And it also makes sense, and I'll conclude to link this to what Honorable said about, Africa coming together. It's like Africa coming together to push which ethical or even shared ethical norms or shared ethical principles, when it's all about survival. When we have, our treasurers in the political parties being business people that have got to push their own interests. But then what are their ethical norms and what are their value system? So Africa can unite, but if Africa is uniting on rotten ground, where unethical leadership is the culture of the day, then actually Africa might as well not unite while we sort ourselves out. So Botswana, basically, I'm saying it's the same thing. It's the culture of unethical leadership, the culture of lack of accountability. If we don't push for a culture of accountability and ethical leadership, and then from there we expect political parties to behave ethically, where they push procurement contracts for their own interests, I think maybe we're asking for too much and we're being unfair. The question is, what are we doing as members of political parties to drive a particular culture of ethics and a culture of of integrity, that when the people in the parties now go into government, the same value system of ethics and integrity actually govern how they govern. Because I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking how unfair it is sometimes that even as a civil society, we want to push for certain things that we've never taught our leaders, that we never even demand from our leaders, and then we expect miracles. So I will just conclude by saying it is the same. It's all about survival. Political parties will want to survive. Businesses will want to survive, because we've cultivated a particular culture of survivalism, a particular culture of scavenging. So businesses scavenge, and you've got politicians who also scavenge to maintain power. So of course, they're going to push it however way they can, in a more realistic way, and usually it's the corrupt way, and it's a pillaging in a looted way. And procurement actually enables that. It helps it because there's lots of money to do it, and it enables that kind of structure to persist. So thank you.
Thank you, Morapedi. I want to bring Mr. Tethani Kizito from Malawi. You've just had our sister from Botswana sharing that most of this corruption happens because it's all about survival. Political parties want to survive, business persons want to survive, so they have to keep their connection and networks and keep themselves in power. So from your side in Malawi, recently I just had the current president was complaining about the procurement laws in your country, and I know it's a new regime in place. Could you please take us through on how the previous regimes, because I know this is a new regime, previous regimes have been financing their campaign, and whether there were some proceeds from public procurement corruption ending up in financing some of the political party activities and also candidates?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I want to trace your questions from where we are coming from, because we need to understand that indeed politics has become very, very expensive, unlike before. And the history of it is that I think most of African countries used to be run by one-party systems, whereby there was no competition on one side, but also that there was a fusion between party and government, and therefore there wasn't really a clear knowledge of how those political parties were being financed, particularly because one wouldn't distinguish between party and government. But having achieved multi-party politics, I think things changed. The playing field changed in that we introduced competition. Whereby political parties had to begin to campaign, to run for their money, and they needed to finance, their campaigns. The problem is, how do they do that? And now, in the specific case of Malawi, our interest in the party financing has gone through three phases. The first phase is what I've just referred to, the one-party phase. The second phase, from 93 to 2018, we had a regulatory regime whereby we made an attempt to regulate political party financing, mentioning public financing, where the government financed some political parties that reached a certain threshold. And there was an attempt to regulate private financing. Although in the legal framework, there was nothing here. There was quite, I would say, silence on how to regulate private financing. That ignited a change of our law in that in 2018, we came up with a Political Parties Act that actually tries to regulate how private financing to political parties would be looked into. Now, the challenge is that we are doing this in a broad framework where we have weak accountability institutions on one hand. On the other hand, we have almost a non-existent private sector. Our law says that political parties are free to solicit funding from individuals or from businesses, or should I say from the private sector. The challenge is that the private sector thrives on the public sector. The private sector thrives on government contracts. And you can see that one would actually make a link that if a political party would solicit funding from the private sector, it is by and large trying to get funding that could have come from money that is not as clean. We are looking at the way we need to regulate that. The current law says that while political parties are free to solicit private financing, there is a threshold. If an individual gives money to a political party up to about, I would say, $1,000, $1,000, then the political party has to disclose that so-and-so has given us this much money. If the resources are coming from a private organization, say a company, the law says that if the donation is up to $2,000, then the recipient political party has to disclose that we have gotten this much money from such a company. Now, I said that this framework is working in a specific environment where, one, we have weak accountability institutions, and two, the private sector is almost non-existent. And here's the problem. If you belong to an opposition party, it would almost mean that no private company would finance you, because if they do, it means that they would be blacklisted by the government. They would no longer get some contracts. And so all the private players would flock to the party that is in government, just because doing so would actually ensure their security. You talked about the previous regime and the current regime. To me, I think the trend is the same. We have seen that throughout our, should I say, multi-party history, you would have a political party that is struggling to survive. When it's in an opposition, it's struggling to survive, it's struggling to raise money for campaign or to run its own affairs. But immediately they get into power, things change. Their problem becomes, how do they use the money? They suddenly have a lot of money at their disposal, which means that once you're in power, you do have access to these resources, which could be a result, or should I say, proceeds of crime. So there is that intricate or intimate relationship between political party financing and corruption, political party financing and procurement. And so our law tries to limit that. We are not registering a lot of successes, because I think there are some weaknesses within the law. And one would also say that those who have power to implement the change are not as enthusiastic. You see people being slow at doing what is right. We passed our Political Parties Act in 2018, but as I'm speaking now, it hasn't been fully implemented. We have seen an election coming and going. No political party has declared where they got resources to run their flamboyant campaigns. And one can only guess, where did this money come from? Why is it that those who are charged with responsibility are not doing what the law requires them to do? And so I think there is a problem there. We have to ensure that we are making our laws stronger. The reasoning is not really to be punitive to the parties, but it's actually trying to protect them, that they shouldn't get captured either before they get into power or immediately they get into power. Because once they get captured, then you cannot talk about reading corruption out of politics. And you cannot talk about making politics less expensive. And so I do agree with the previous speakers that there is a problem that we have to face, I think, head on. We have to, in my view, make our laws stronger, and we have to make our institutions work so that we can check the use and abuse of public resources. We can ensure that somebody is actually accountable. Somebody is there to tell the citizens where they are getting money, and somebody is there to actually be free to put the books out there into the open so that we can trace where money is coming from. I think if we can strengthen those regulations, we can begin talking about controlling how we are using money. We can begin to talk about getting rid of dirty money out of our politics. And by doing so, I would even argue that we would begin to level our playing field. I think I would stop there at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. I will now go to cross to Kenya. Harriet, Kenya is now having flashy elections and all that campaigns are there, and we know political parties and candidates are all over looking for resources to campaign. And there have been scandals before in Kenya, like we heard about the Anglo leasing scandal. And I know there are certain scandals that could have happened even before or during even now, which we could not be knowing. So can you be able to share with us some of the happenings in Kenya in terms of public procurement corruption and financing of political parties and also candidates?
Thank you, Abel, and good afternoon, everyone. Jumbo from a very chilly Nairobi. It's interesting that you've actually just mentioned the Anglo leasing scandal, because that's actually one of the things that I really wanted to talk about today. Just in 2004, there is this, we have a new government, a new administration, testing out multi-party politics. And Kenyans are excited. There's a new president who came in on a very strong anti-corruption agenda. It creates an office that had never been heard of before, an ethics advisor in the office of the president. And 2 years in 2004, this gentleman, gets wind of some contracts that have been awarded to fictitious companies, and he starts investigating, and indeed it leads him to the doorstep of very senior, powerful individuals, the vice president's office, senior cabinet secretaries or ministers as they were known back then, and at some point he even has to flee the country because it becomes too hot. He's unearthed and uncovered something that that was just not viable for him to continue investigating. And what he discovered was, or what was intimated to him, was that these fictitious contracts the contracts were real. As a matter of fact, we've actually been still paying some of them that were awarded to fictitious companies, were a mode of raising funds for the campaigns in 2007. And if you can recall, 2007 is one of the most hotly contested elections we've ever had as a country, that even led to a coalition government that saw a lot of violence, at least that recorded quite a significant number of deaths. And just last week or a few weeks ago, the last remaining proponents of this scandal were actually let go by the courts, citing insufficient evidence. And unfortunately for the whistleblower, John Githongo, he was actually slapped with defamation costs, a very nasty story. So I was just recalling, what has changed in Kenya since 2004 to date, and are there, just to answer your questions, are there any scandals that we think are feeding into political party financing? And the answer is not very much has changed in that regard. We still have a lot of corruption scandals that are happening, and we can almost trace these happenings to a need to finance our political parties and upcoming elections. What happened in 2002 happened at a time when we still had an old constitution. Our legislative framework for dealing with corruption was still weak. So what we have done, and I've heard my brother from Malawi talking about, enacting laws and getting policies in place. In Kenya, I can say we have an overabundance of legislation that deals with issues of political party financing, election campaign financing, and public procurement and public finance management. We got a new constitution in 2010, which would, arguably created a scenario where would stem some of the happenings, or would take care of or manage, such outright and blatant theft of public funds. And this brought in, new legislation, with regards to public procurement, political parties. We have a Political Parties Act. We have, conflict of interest laws, the Leadership and Integrity Act, and Public Officer Ethics Act. And this, even with this in place, we still struggle with scandals and having monies in circulation that might, or that are likely end up financing political parties. The Political Parties Act actually provides for, it caps the amount of money an individual or a corporate can donate to a political party. It caps it, I think, to 20% of the total political party budget. And it also establishes a political parties fund. This is the exchequer funding political parties. But there's a formula to that. Only, I think, the three top political parties that have, managed to get people in parliament are the ones that get a share of this political parties fund. And in the large scheme of things, when you look at how much money is spent in elections, that really is a very small bit of how political parties raise their money. We even got more ambitious, and we got an Election Campaign Financing Act in 2013, immediately after the 2013 elections. And this has been the most interesting thing that we have witnessed as a country, because what happened then, they actually said this will enact this, will enforce this act in 2017. Come 2017, Parliament, in their wisdom, because what we do with our laws is you have the act, then you require regulations to implement the act. So in 2017, Parliament said, you know what, these regulations, there is a problem. Let us enact it in 2022. Let us implement in 2022. We are now in 2022. And the same scenario occurred. There were issues with the regulations that were tabled in Parliament. For those of us that follow Kenyan politics, we saw Parliament saying these regulations cannot come to Parliament at this particular time. We saw the electoral management body struggling to say, even if we don't have regulations, can we then have spending limits? Can we attempt to give spending limits, for political parties and candidates? And this also was thrown out. In the backdrop of this, we have a very strong Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act enacted in 2015. Again, attendant regulations that came in mid-2020. And we have open procurement, as it were, or, we publish our procurement data to some extent. We have a public procurement information portal. And what this does is we are meant to publish the people that are awarded public contracts, right? We want, and from a recent regulation that came out early this year, anybody who gets a public contract, any company that gets a public contract then gets to publish their directors and their beneficial owners, people who ultimately own the companies that are getting public contracts. And this is public information. So, but we haven't started publishing the beneficial ownership information yet. What this therefore means is that there is still that gap. There is still an opaqueness with regards to the people that get the companies that get public contracts that are owned by politicians or by the political elite that are able to manipulate the system and get the contracts. And this is very rampant. This is and there's a loophole in the law that allows politicians to do, or the politically exposed persons to do business with government. But it is not enough that they are allowed to do legitimate business. They go ahead and hide behind some people and set up companies and do a lot of illegal business, or they get contracts where they don't deliver, or they deliver at premium cost for very substandard goods. And we have seen these scandals come up time and time again. Looking at it just occurred to me that when this Anglo leasing scandal occurred, it was about 2-3 years to the next election. In 2020, there are people who smiled when COVID hit. There are people who did not see this as a pandemic, rather than an opportunity to raise money for an upcoming elections in 2022. And look at the scandal that ensued with the emergency procurement that happened. There are people that were awarded contracts. Their names that were whispered, as beneficiaries of these contracts, that to date have not been charged in court. The monies have not been recovered. And now we are actively in the middle of an election with unregulated financing. Nobody knows. There is no requirement for these political parties or independent candidates to tell us the sources of funds, because the act, well, we said regulations will not work. So that act is really not happening. The registrar of political parties can only do so much. It can only go after funds by political parties, and it's just an audit, which we'll probably get to see 3-4 years after the election. So we see there's still a big problem, even in in having a strong legislation on public procurement, on managing conflict of interests, looking at leadership and integrity, and even attempting to regulate political party spending. So there's a very big correlation between the corruption that happens in Kenya and how this money ultimately ends up in political parties. And this, just to conclude, this category of people, politically exposed persons, there is especially the elected ones in certain cadres, it's almost impossible to get them out of office. And it really, there's usually a special regime to get them out. If it's for governors, you have to impeach them. And we've only had 2 successful convictions, and this, for fear of contradiction, really, we can say were politically motivated. There were several others that were supposed to be impeached, but because they were in the right political parties, they skated, they managed to escape that. It gets worse, that if you have a corruption case ongoing in court, and most of these corruption cases are procurement related, you have to you have to be convicted and exhaust all avenues of appeal before you are stopped from vying again to get into power to do bigger and better things with people's money. So having that legislation is good, and we celebrate, the steps that we have. Very strong laws, even on beneficial ownership, and now, publicly declaring who beneficial owners are. We now need to move into the implementation and look at how are this legislation, how is this legislation stopping, Kenyans from losing public funds, and how is it an example to the rest of the region, and even in Africa. How can we then be used to benchmark through our implementation of the wonderful laws that we have? And sorry, one quick thing. It is worth noting that some of these monies, there was a study that was done by I think the Netherlands Institute of Multi-Party Democracy on the cost of elections in Kenya. And looking at the councillors, that was the one that, or the equivalent of council seats in Kenya, these people spend an equivalent of an year's salary campaigning, an year's salary for the 5 years. Essentially, all the entire, the salary that they will earn for those 5 years is the amount of money that they use to campaign to get into office. So once they get in and they've exhausted this, where do you think they're going to get money to buy bread and milk and feed their families and this and all that? So just to point out to a point that was made by the previous speaker, I think by Kusetso, about making realistic demands on this issue and trying to put it into context. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. I'll now go to Nigeria. I'll bring you on board, Mr. Agenyi Arome. You've listened to all our other panelists and you've enjoyed whatever they have been sharing with us. So from your own point of view from Nigeria, I know Nigeria has a very special and very interesting dynamics about politics in this continent. So I want you to share with us your own perspective in terms of how the political parties in Nigeria do raise their funds and whether proceeds from procurement end up in financing some of these political parties.
Thank you very much, and I want to say jambo to everyone. I'm a friend of the East African because I spent some of my time in East Africa. I want to say jambo, and I want to thank ACFIN for this webinar series. This is very important at this time that some of us are having conversations around rethinking and remodeling the African democratic system. How can we redefine democracy for us as African? How can we remodel democracy for us as African? Better be of more advantage for us as African than what we are currently seeing. Because what democracy is for us as African today, for me, from my own perspective, is not what I feel democracy should be. If it is a government of the people, by the people and for the people, then the people should be at the center. The people should be at the core of everything that has to do with democracy, beginning from the leadership making process to the decision making process, both in the parliament and in the executive arm of the government. And now narrowing down to the issues around public procurement and political financing. It's a very interesting conversation, and I want to start on this note that if Africa must get it right, if we must get it right as African, one of the critical things we need to start addressing is evolving a legal framework at the continental level to deal with the issues of political financing. It's very critical because the question of inclusion, the question of participation for young people, for women, for people living with disability, and other group of citizens would not be a difficult thing if we can address the issues of political financing. Why do I say this? There is a strong connections between public procurement and political financing. And if you look at it critically, who are the people that gain the government contract? Just like every other colleague on this platform had also spoken about in their different contexts, how government contract is being allocated in their different contexts. In Nigeria, for example, we have the Public Procurement Act, which detail the processes and the principles that guide the procurement of government contracts and different of goods and services that is aligned to government. That's aligned to government. Now, this government contract is gotten by people that has very strong political influence. Those who has godfathers that are backing them on. They are the one that gets this particular government contract. And when you look at it critically in Nigeria, the people that get these contracts largely sponsor the people that come on board for different political parties as candidates contesting for different political offices in Nigeria. Now, in the case in 2015, we had a case where the richest man in Africa, Dangote, was giving the then sitting president, Goodluck Jonathan, was supporting his campaign organization with a whooping sum of about 500 million naira, which is a huge amount of money. Now, tell me, why is he giving that particular amount of money to support the sitting president for his political campaign. You all know that he who plays the pipers detests the tune. So if you bring in a huge chunk of money from your own business to support my political campaign, invariably I am saying to you that when you get into the political office, you should carve out a chunk part of the government contract and allocate it to my company so that I can recoup the money I have spent for your political office. So that is part of, so there is that strong connections between political public procurement and political financing. And I was wondering, in my mind, I was wondering why I was left to be the last person to speak to this issue. And I started reflecting that Nigeria is a very large country, and from our strategic placement in African continent, you will also see that Nigeria has a peculiar case when it comes to political financing. The Nigerian case, permit me to say that it's a mess-up case. Why do I say it's a mess-up case? We have currently the amount that is required, the limit for campaign financing for political party in Nigeria has been raised from 1 billion naira to 5 billion naira, which is about $2 million US dollars for political parties to campaign during the elections, during the elections, for every election cycle. Now, how do this money come by? If you are very conversant, if you are following the Nigerian political history, you see that in recent times, the just concluded political party primaries was awash with different level of corrupt practices. We heard of political party candidates that are buying delegate vote for as much as $50,000, $45,000, $12,000, and $15,000. We have also heard of how political parties are selling their candidate form for as much as 100 million naira, which is about 250 or 50,000 US dollar. Now, tell me, narrow it down to the issue of participation and inclusion. How can a young person or a woman who have not worked to raise as much as this amount of money participate effectively in a highly monetized political system as this that we have in our country? Then when you look at it, the issues of implications of different policies and legal frameworks that tries to regulate campaign financing, the issues of implementation also comes in. Political parties are not adherent to the different legislations and different legal frameworks that guides on that limits how much a political party should spend during the election process. For example, the section 93 of the Nigerian Electoral Act, stipulate that every political party at the end, 3 months after the conclusion of every elections and the declaration of the elections, that the political parties are expected to turn in the audited report of the entire political campaign process. But permit me to say that since beginning from 1999 to the current time, no political parties in Nigeria have submitted the audited report of their political campaign processes beginning from 1999 to this particular time. So enforcement of this particular legislation also becomes a very critical thing that is militating against a healthy political system. So if we are to address issues around political financing as it relates to public procurement, we need to put up a strong judicial system that is emphatic about the issues around sanctions, that is so committed to ensuring that every damn detail that is stipulated in the Electoral Act or maybe a particular legal framework is being implemented to the letter. Yeah. We also have a group of political elites that I term as political bandits. By political bandits, I am referring to a class of politicians that have decided to a class of political elites that have decided to take over, to kidnap our political system, using money as a strong weapon to disenfranchise citizens that are eligible to vote at every level of the political process. So if we there is a conscious effort needs to be taken in order to deal with this particular issue at every level within Nigeria and across the African continent. So if I will submit at this point to say that if we must deal with the issues of public procurement and political financing, it is very important for us to start thinking at the African Union level to strengthen some of the pro-democratic legislative frameworks within the African continent to address issues around political financing, and also sanctions people that default in not adhering to some of these critical principles in order to have a strong political system. If we must build a strong and a sustainable Africa, an Africa that is inclusive, an Africa that is sustainable, an Africa that builds a world of her own, an Africa that is not looking up to the European countries to raise money for them to implement some of their development strategy. It is very important for us to reorientate our political elite, also reinvent a new political culture in order to address critical issues that touches on the monetizations of the entire political space, in order for us to create an inclusive environment where young people, where women, and every citizen is being able to participate effectively without any sort of prejudice. So if you permit me, I'll drop it at this point and allow the conversations to go on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Again. I'll bring back now Honorable Stephen Mustale. You initially talked about some issue concerning how some foreign companies and African leaders nowadays connive to get contracts from African countries, and they also bring in the loans, and those loans are used to service some of the African roads, but most of the personnel are brought from their countries. I'll give an example of China. People are now looking at Africa that it has been there's Chinization of Africa because Chinese are all over the continent. And I want to know from you, what magic is China using to ensure that most of the big ticket deals or government contracts go to them, and also these leaders continue to dine with the Chinese companies and award the Chinese those contracts? Could there be a way that some of the money or the Chinese are getting through those contracts ends up coming back? And how do we address that as a continent? Because we talked of us coming together as a continent and address these issues, but we have seen most of our leaders are again taken out to even attend some of these conferences organized by China and France and what. So how can we address such an issue? You are muted.
Are you getting me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm saying salutation to all the panelists. You were all loud and clear, and you actually continue to confirm that the African borders were not made in our interests. And the very purpose the partition of Africa was done was for the capitalists who had interest in having their business areas under different heads of states, so that by then it was the colonists. By now, the colonists do not need to come back. They are using our own leaders, our own public servants, our own political elected by us, but to serve the foreign interests. That's the point I hammered in the first, and that's why I didn't even make much reference to my own systems in Uganda, because I'm aware most African countries had what we call central tender boards and central purchasing corporations, which made bulk purchases for office supplies. In Uganda, we had on Uganda all stationery, which was labeled on Uganda government service. Now we are in era of computer supplies. Why at this point in era you cannot find government making sure that even these are coming from home? The World Bank consensus around the 90s did introduce this competitive bidding. The competitive bidding was basically a tool of the World Bank and IMF to open our gates We privatized our small industries. We opened the gate in the name of investors, attracting investors to our countries. Basically, what we are doing was to make sure that competitive bidding, my Ugandan company cannot bid with a German company, cannot bid with a Chinese company. And that's why you see in Uganda, whereas we claim to have Uganda National Roads Authority, we don't have a single Ugandan company doing the road construction. What the Chinese did, that in the first 8 years, they bidded low all the roads. They even chased the American and the British companies and the Indian companies. So basically, it is a cartel right now in Uganda. And I'm sure in many countries, I've been to Zambia, I've been to Malawi, I've been to DRC, I've been to all our neighbors in South Sudan. It is now the same Chinese companies who go to their embassy and say China Railway, China CCC, China what, China what. They basically agree in the embassy, in the economic commercial attach, and say, okay, we have just had the oil roads in my region. I'm a beneficiary of these roads. But they just agree. It's a collusion, it's a cartel. And for me, this is where I want us to look at, that we're better off improving our own central tender boards and central purchasing cooperation than opening ourselves completely to the multinationals in the name of competitive bidding under the public procurement and disposal. We've tried even to make amendments to these laws in Uganda, but with very little success. Now, what is happening right now? It is true, China is increasingly becoming the world economic power, and there is every confirmation. It is abundantly clear that they are going to become anyway. They have the population, they have the technology, and we opened. I wish when they were coming here, we were giving them some conditions of local content that were to come and work in Uganda. There was some 40% of local content which will be also responsible in maintaining at least, because right now, even in maintaining the roads, you may require to bring back the challenge. So the areas of dealing with this challenge, because we are countries who have just come back to multi-party like Uganda. I don't want to talk about challenge of multi-party. It's a big topic. If I open a Pandora box to discuss the deficit, the inept in terms of our institutions we want to call political parties. The point I'm saying is that when you do interconnection, if you say these Chinese are going to do roads in DRC, in Uganda, in Kenya, you can negotiate bulk. You can reduce them on cheating on us. You can you reduce the state house clearance. You can discuss as a region and get a better deal. Because what should we be getting, for example, in this China bridge and the project? Because road and bridge project, what we could be getting is technology transfer. What we could be getting, capacity to build our own companies. What could we be getting? We could be getting local content. At the moment, you get a deal by some state house clearance, by some strong man who is a sponsor of a ruling party, then you miss out on even placing the young engineers of a country in a project of 10 years or 5 years by the time they leave. Again, oil. We are having now Chinese and European companies coming to produce oil from my constituency, from my region, the Albertine region. But we are not building enough capacity to say at the next stage of getting oil in DRC, in Sudan and the Virunga, we are going to be our own experts. It is completely left in the hands. And we are importing furniture, we are importing stationaries, we are importing everything. And therefore, I wish it was some little commission made on a procurement, but you also build some low capacity. My disappointment and why I was discussing the bigger picture of industrial policy, of local content, and buying from the rich north is that I don't see the exit plan from this quagmire. My concern is we are increasingly sinking into this quagmire that we have to bring the same Chinese to repair this road. We are going to bring the same Chinese to repair this pipeline to Tanga, and that couldn't be the case. So that's why I'm saying, how can we, as we discuss the financing of politics through the state capture of these multinationals, who by the way are the ones commanding? We seem to be discussing as Parliament of Uganda, we seem to be discussing as the executive, but basically it is the multinationals, it is this, the principals are the ones who inform the laws, the regulations in our procurement. This is single sourcing, direct procurement. All this is informed by somebody up there who is going to finance the political status quo in advance. So you say the project was late, we want direct procurement of these dams. We can no longer go through a long process of due diligence. Let us now just give this dam to the company. It's basically informed by this corruption. And I am saying my disappointment is that our political class, both elected and civil servants, have betrayed Africa by just working for this short-term commission in the interest of the imperials, if I can call them, without any single iota, without any single attempt to say, how do we exit? How do we build local industry? How do we have local content? How do we have our own construction company? Because that should be the ideal of a government, of a government in any country. But to see we are increasingly in bed with those who have tormented us is unfortunate. We don't seem to be having something to bequeath our children in Uganda. Here we use the word the grandchildren. We are trying to say we are securing the future of the grandchildren. But how do you do that when you are increasingly becoming indebted to China, when you are increasingly depending on foreign companies, when there is and I earlier mentioned why I thank Nigerian banks and South Africa, because it is Africa. The telecom companies, it's Africa. I can know that MTN and some of these companies tomorrow, there's something which can help Africa. But surely China does not help Africa in terms of infrastructure. And I would like to say we need to agree as a country. If we do joint venture Africa corridors, Africa pipelines, Africa industries, Africa telecoms, Africa banks, Africa insurance is the bigger way to make sure that at the end of the day there is an exit plan. Because how they succeeded to balkanize us was to say, you deal with Uganda alone, deal with Kenya alone, deal with Tanzania alone. But when we come together and make these projects for everybody, we reduce corruption. At the end of the day, we are building our own banks, our own industries, our own pipelines, and reduce depending on importing. So as we discuss the campaign financing, I wouldn't want us to lose the bigger picture of making sure what is the roadmap, what is the exit plan, how do we intend to redirect these resources, because any money being spent at the end of the day going to the foreign companies, the bigger part, because the money going to election is just change. It's just a commission you find in some of this business is 0.00% is what's financing election. But the bigger money has gone back to the principals, their capitals. And for me, that's the leakage, that's the hemorrhage. I would like us to look at and say there is a lot if we decided to forego. The Bible talks of selling a birthright for something, for some small eats of one evening. So for me, I really want to say that in this webinar of this month, it is very important that we are discussing what actually is increasingly keeping us indebted. We are choking. A lot of African countries where our debt has reached 50% GDP ratio, and that means we are no longer sustainable. We are having jobless growth. A country is declared middle income when in actual sense the Human Development Index speaks the opposite. You know, you find that the education system has challenges. I don't want to talk about the strikes I'm having in Uganda right now. Our schools are not, children going to school in government school for almost 2 weeks because we are paying a lot of our debt stock is too high. At the end of the day, the point I'm trying to make, that there is a trade-off. The moment politicians enjoy this comfort of some change in terms of commission and their power retention, there is a high toll. Uganda now, 25% of our budget is debt servicing. So it means health, social services, including education, has to miss out, and the priority is being emphasized on areas which does not help the common man. So that's why we have jobless growth. We have graduates without jobs. That's why we have increasing it. And let me bring in the COVID issue, because even with COVID, it becomes more worse because there are more areas which need public goods. People are poor. There are more people who are running public. So I would like to emphasize that at the end of the day, it's not sustainable for those who think being commission agents and being in collusion with the multinationals as they fix contracts for themselves it's not sustainable. At the end of the day, you're going to make your country more dependent. I am not opposed to interdependence. I'm not opposed to, I would want us to build a self-sustained Great Lakes, East African economy and promote intra-Africa trade. Let us buy from within Africa, create jobs within Africa, and that's when the people will also, the civic competence can be built, and we are able to engage. Right now, when our people are poor, we can't even engage the political system. We can't engage the political class, and that's why I'm calling it a betrayal. So I commend Archfield and the civil society who are there to speak for the voiceless. This is our area where we need really to make sure that we engage the political system in the interest of the powerless, in the interest of the voiceless, of the weak, who actually may not even understand what we are discussing right now. So it's a very gigantic problem, but it's doable if we agree to unite as Africa and engage to make sure that our money at the end of the day is building our own economy for the good of our people. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable. I'll bring Harriet here now. You talked about how some of the electoral laws in Kenya are not being implemented because Parliament has kicked them out. But I have seen that in many of our African countries, the electoral legal framework is devoid of provisions that bar private companies that have running government contracts from making campaign contributions, including to the very party in power. Do you think this could constitute one of the fertile grounds for those political parties, those companies, giving political parties and candidates money to campaign now that Kenya is having an election? And I know maybe Kenya also doesn't have this law that bars already companies that have running contracts from making contributions to political parties. What is your take on that, and how can we address some of this?
I mean, definitely. What the provision I was citing before in the Political Parties Act that seeks to regulate the amount of money that a single entity or a single individual can donate to a political party is then silent on what happens during the campaign period. In Kenyans, we have this knack. It's like we are inbuilt to try and make things as complicated and as divided as possible. So the provisions of political party funding are in that Political Parties Act, but then when it comes to political party financing, now we have a different act, and which we have made sure has not been applicable in the last 2 elections since it was enacted. And this is where all these issues come in, because the upshot of that is we do not know who is making donations to political parties, to individual candidates, because this is what this act was meant to do. It was meant to regulate monies for elections. And you can agree with me, most of the funds that are raised by political parties or individuals, a huge chunk of it, 90% of it is spent during the election period. The rest of the electoral cycle, maybe, and the primaries, which of course happened during the tail end of that electoral cycle. So if we do not regulate this funding, how much money can be spent, then it is open season. Because even if we use the formula provided in the Political Parties Act, just 20% of the money that we hear being thrown around for presidential campaigns that run into millions of dollars, that's a single contract to, tarmac a road from point A to point B, or to provide vehicles for account. That's a single contract to somebody. And if they can just drop, that to a candidate or a political party, then they're set. So it's just a matter of strengthening and even making requirements for disclosure, which is also missing, which is what, again, some of these things that this Election Campaign Financing Act was seeking to cure. Disclosing sources of funds, disclosing the amounts that have been, that this, whoever your contributors are, disclosing how much they're giving you. And coupled that, when we couple that with our public procurement laws that are now very progressive and are requiring contract disclosure, we seal a loophole. So what is lacking? We now know who is getting government contracts. We know their directors, because this is public information, is published. We will start knowing who their beneficial owners are, if they are politicians, and almost always they will be politicians. And now we start making demands for disclosure of political party sources of political party funds or election campaigning funds. Then we'll have sealed that loophole. Unless and until that is done, then the issue will keep recurring. So it's something that we're paying very close attention to. And just to note, the 2022 elections in Kenya are quite unique. They have a level playing ground in terms of who can use the most, or who has access to dirty money, as it were. We have an incumbent, a deputy president, a current sitting deputy president, who is going against the ruling party. So they all have equal share to blame for any corruption scandal. They had their chances to scramble for this very juicy contracts, and it would be, had we had this law in place, or requirements for disclosure, then it would have painted an interesting picture. But until that is done, until we have requirements to disclose the sources and the amounts and the sources of funds for campaigns, I fear that the problem will still recur.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to bring Sizito from Malawi. There's a time when public procurement laws were touted as a magic wand for corruption, but it has turned out that now the men and women in government are using the very laws to add a veneer of legality to their routine. Why is it the case, and what are we getting wrong as Africans? Because we have the laws in place, but the men and women in government are using also the very laws to steal. They have mastered the art of playing around the laws to loot. So what should we do as Africans and as a country so that we don't see a lot of money being stolen through procurement and maybe end up flowing into campaign financing some of these candidates?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's, as one of the colleagues said, to have the laws in place is one thing, but to see them implemented, I think, is another. There are a number of gaps that I think are allowing such malpractices to, to continue occurring. One of which would be the loopholes in the laws. If I can give our own example from Malawi, our law attempted to target financing to political parties. However, it is silent on financing to an individual politician. If a company or a private organization gives money to an individual who happens to be a politician running for office, the law does not actually regulate that. And so I think that would be a gap that one has to think about. I would also mention the issue of anonymous benefactors. People argue that while we are trying to advance accountability, we should also think about the right to privacy of individuals. And so the question would be, if somebody donates money or resources, financial or otherwise, to a political party and says, here is $1,000, but I don't want my name mentioned anywhere. What should a party do? Do we have to respect the right to privacy of that individual, or we think about the larger picture of enhancing accountability to avoid that the situation where political parties are benefiting from proceeds of crime? So those would be some of the challenges that I think we need to look at. I would also want to talk about the silence regarding campaign financing. In the specific case of our country, we tried to target the general financing to political parties without specifically targeting campaign financing. And that brings a problem in that as I think our colleague from Kenya mentioned, a lot of resources to political parties do come in during the campaign. And if we have a legal framework, that doesn't give a cap to how much a political party can spend for campaign, I think that would be a challenge. So I think that we need to tighten our legal frameworks. Not only tightening them, but we have to ensure that they are implementable, that we have an infrastructure that ensures that we are implementing, we are enforcing compliance. We have, in our case, our Political Parties Act, that, as I said previously, it came into force in 2018. But to date, there is nothing you can point at. It is not being respected, it is not being implemented, and there is impunity. We appear to be powerless in ensuring that we are abiding to the law that we ourselves as a country put in place. So I think that there is quite a lot that we have to do. And the linkages that we have to build, coming to your question, between our procurement laws and our laws about financing political parties. I think there has to be a conversation among us players, the political parties themselves, the politicians, but also the procurement specialists and the private sector. How do we ensure that we are all paddling in the same direction? How do we ensure that our different pieces of law are talking to each other to make sure that we don't have loopholes or weaknesses, or I can say the weak points that can be exploited to run away from the obligations that political parties do have? I think there is a problem that is not being addressed well enough. When we are talking about the question of regulating private financing into political parties, I think we have to understand this in the general framework, that we want to actually protect those political parties from being captured. We want to protect those political parties from benefiting from proceeds of crime. And I believe that even before we think about strengthening or we think about the legislations, we have to reflect about how we can make our politics cheaper, if I may use that way. Because we are having, politics that is really expensive. For one to run for office, as we heard, I think, from Botswana, from Uganda, from Kenya, people do spend a lot of money. And if people spend that much money, they have to finance, finance it one way or the other. If they use their personal resources, as some people claim, we have to be sure that once they get into office, they will have to find a way of recouping, those resources. So I think our laws that are trying to regulate financing have to look at how we should make this politics cheap. How do we stop, for instance, the issue of handouts or that people give when they are campaigning? Maybe the regulation should start not only at the point when the political party gets resources, it should start from the financing of our politics in general, to make sure that our politics and our elections are not as expensive as they are today. If we continue having, a political regime or our politics that are this expensive, then it will be difficult for us to stop the malpractice that is happening. Again, looking at the backdrop where we in Africa, we don't really have a private sector. Our private sector thrives on the government. And that linkage is a dangerous linkage. Because those people in business, for them to survive, they have to win government contracts. For them to win government contracts, they have to give kickbacks to those people who have power to make them win those contracts. So if we can break this vicious cycle, maybe we can begin to make some progress in how we regulate our funding to political parties. I think at this point I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to bring here now our sister from Botswana. I don't know whether she's still online. I don't know whether she's on. But if she's not on, I will bring on. I will bring in our brother from Nigeria again. We have Honorable Muchitale discussed about the capture of our political parties and our governments by these multinational corporations that give us money and loans. And how can we have a discussion like as a continent from African Union, from a body like African Union, to ensure that we make sure our countries are not so indebted and not so captured, and our political parties do not base on most of these companies to get their money to run their campaigns, and they end up giving back contracts to those people. Then those people also end up financing their campaigns. How can we break away from such capture?
This is I would say this a very tricky question, but I would love to address this from this not tricky in a way, but tricky in a way. But this is what I would say. We all know that one of the biggest problem we have in Africa is the question of leadership, and until we have an arrowhead leader who can spearhead the African development, then we are not in any way about to start the journey of advancing the African development. We have likes of Maman Gaddafi of blessed memory that was taken away. We have other African leaders as well too that spearhead these conversations, and we need to really begin to think about these people. Now, first thing that I would say is that we need to change our leadership recruitment process in Africa as a whole. We need to narrow down our mind to start thinking of recruiting leaders that are people-centered, leaders that are service-oriented, leaders that have values, that shares the African values, like the Kwame Nkrumahs, that shares the values that Kwame Nkrumah shares at the dawn of campaigning for the African liberations. We need to entirely change our leadership recruitment process so that we can bring on board leaders that think about the people and not leaders that think about what they are not leaders that think about what they can gain from the entire African society. That's one. Then number two, we also need to change our followership reorientation, because one of the things that I've also seen in my course of work across some countries within the African continent and in Nigeria is the fact that we largely have the questions of followership. Now, why do I say that? we have a typical, who is giving this money? They are followers, they are citizens. So we need to have a crop of citizens, a crop of followers that will refuse to take this money from this political elite. We need to have this crop of followers that will sign up to a value that protects the commonality, that protect the commonwealth of the entire citizens and not just a particular person. So by that, what I'm saying is that followers need to be not to be self-centered, but need to be more open-minded to look at the benefit of the other people within the society and not just a singular person. So we need to change our leadership recruitment process. We need to also enforce our followership. Then number 3, Africa is not lacking policies. Just permit me to say that Africa is not lacking policy. We don't have the problem of issues around policy development in Africa, but we have the issues of enforcement. We have the issues of implementation, adherence. Our political elites are not adhering to most of the policies that they made. And I'll give you an example. In Nigeria, for example, in 2019, the current president, in ECOWAS, we have the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance. And one of the things that the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance puts out is the fact that no government must sign up, must sign up amend her electoral act 6 months to any general election. Now, this particular clause in the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance has been lying down there. There are other beautiful clauses, there are other beautiful provisions of the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, such that protects the right of the media, such that protects the right of young people that are protesting, such that protects the right of women and every other citizens. These ones are not being respected. But when it touches on changing the date for ascending to the Electoral Act in 2019, that the sitting president knows that the moment he assents to the bill, it will definitely impact on his election in 2019. The president refuses to assent to that particular bill using the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance as an excuse. So our leaders are so selfish. So they are aware of these particular policies that are there, but the implementations of this policy is a very huge issue within most countries within the African continent. So what do we then do as civil society organization, as citizens, as individuals? There is need for us to upskill conversations around some of these policy documents and ensure that government at every level adhere to the principles that are embedded in this particular legal frameworks and these policies. Also, citizens are known, I also want to speak to the young people at this particular point. Yes, I cut across that particular age, but I am seeing a generation of young people that are so entitled, that are feeling so entitled. Power is not given, power is being wrested. We need to also educate ourselves as young people. We need to know this policy document that exists. We need to know how it protects our right. We need to know how to engage with it. So we need to educate ourselves as young people at every level in order to match up with these political bandits that are out there trying to siphon the future of Africa and the future of every young person in Africa. So these are critical things that we need to do. You will also agree with me that African leaders are not creative. African leaders are not innovative. And that's why we have all of these issues. So they are only innovative in doing the wrong thing, but not innovative in doing the right thing in order to protect and defend the right of every citizens within the continent. So it's very important for us to organize around changing our leadership recruitment process, in also improving the quality of followership, and also educating the young people and ensuring that policy documents and legislations within the African continent are being adhered to. And also look for a way of strengthening our judicial system, because also one of the large problem we can also see in Africa is the fact that anybody, if you do the wrong thing, you can get away with it in Africa. We see that in Nigeria a lot. We see people defaulting. We heard in 2019, 2019, where a sitting chairman of a political party says that if you do every wrong thing and you move over to this particular political party, all your sins are being forgiven. So we have a very weak judicial and sanction system. So this also needs to be strengthened in order for us to move ahead as African and create that and create a different development trajectory that makes us independent of the funding that comes from these multinationals and depend on the wealth that is coming from Africa, because Africa has the mind, Africa has the creativity, Africa has the innovation, Africa has the strength, we have the resources, and we have everything for us to exist as a continent that is not dependent on any other continent of the world.
Thank you so much. We are left with only about 18 minutes, so I will give each of us about 3 minutes to wrap up for today. So I will start with Mr. Tethani Chizito.
Thank you very much. I want to conclude my presentation by trying to look at another angle that sometimes we tend to forget. It is, I think, most of us have talked about the political leadership, and we've said that I think that's where the backstop, that's where we have a lot of problems. I do agree with that, but I want us not to forget the bureaucracy that works as an enabler to all the corruption, even political corruption that takes place. I'll give you an example of our context here, that the president that we have, the current president, I think on 3 occasions has said about his commitment to ensuring that we are implementing our laws, including the Political Parties Act. At some point, people had put it to him that what would happen if your party would be penalized because it's not complying to the law, or indeed if it is being starved of resources because people are not just giving it. He said that we have to do the right thing. We have to ensure that the laws are working. But you look at the implementation, the people who are working in the public service should also be looked into to ensure that they are implementing the law. I think what happens is that while a lot of blame goes to the politician, who actually, of course, needs the money to run the campaign and whatnot, there are these middle-level people in the bureaucracy who also actually ride on the politician, and they do get their personal benefits, and as they are facilitating this corruption. I think on one hand, they are also beneficiaries. On the other, they fail to implement the law because they are second guessing what they think the politician would love them to do. And so you would find some of them being very slow at implementing what the law tells them to do, because they think that their inaction is what the politician would love to see. So I think as we are encouraging the politician to do the right thing, we shouldn't forget the bureaucracy that actually facilitates or would help to solve some of those problems. And I do agree also, finally, on civic educating our people. We do settle for very less, for very little. During campaigns, people do get maybe a packet of sugar, a tablet of soap, and whatnot, and they would sell their vote because of these little freebies. I think that we need to have a comprehensive, public education or civic education drive that would make people not look for these handouts. Let us show them that these free handouts are actually not free. They are an erosion of public resources that would actually provide for the public services that we all need. And if we can break that cycle, that would be one of the ways that I made reference to, that we should make our politics cheaper. So a focus to the leadership is fine and is good. The focus also should go to the bureaucracy. We shouldn't forget the voter, the citizen who actually benefits from what they think is free. So I think if we work on all these 3 areas, we can begin to make some maybe progressive changes in implementing what we think would be an equitable level of doing our politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tefani. I'll now go to Harriet, your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Just picking up from where my brother from Malawi has stopped. I think yes, it is quite important to educate the masses, so they know and understand that there's that circle that goes around. They stole your money. They're now using it to bribe you to go into power to even steal more money. And there is a need to have citizens, be aware of this fact and know that it's actually possible to have clean politics. As a matter of fact, we've had a member of parliament, a very young gentleman, who did not spend any money. He would walk all over, his constituency and beg for votes. And he spent very little money during his campaigns, and people, were appealed to his ideology and they elected him. So it is possible, and it can be done. I think the other thing I would like to say is it's important that we grow our own solutions to our problems. And looking at our Election Campaign Finance Act, I think it was borrowed from America, word for word, and we threw it at Kenyans. Then when it came to implementation, we realized, oh wait, there are problems here. Our context does not really match what the American context, and therefore we have issues with the way we can implement it. So I think it is important to appreciate and acknowledge our context and then generate laws that operate in that context. And that is not to say we give ourselves leeway because we are in Africa, things are impossible to do. No. Appreciate our culture, our context, and design laws that can operate in that context. It is this is not the time. There was a time when we were looking to the West for almost everything. This is not that time. We have learned, we have the expertise, we have the knowledge, we have the homegrown solutions, and let us implement them. The other thing I'd like to say is I think it's important we take back ownership of our political parties, our political processes. It's in Kenya, it is almost frowned upon to say you belong to a political party. But why can't I belong to a political party, be a paying member, influence this political party's ideology, and therefore, be invested in how this political person goes into office and the agenda they take forward, because ultimately it will be my agenda as a member of that political party. And this helps in mainstreaming accountability. So it would be unthinkable for this person who has these very strong people invested in the ideology, in the workings of that political party. It will be impossible for this person to go and misbehave because the retribution will be swift at political party level. And I feel that aspect misses a lot, and it has left, as our political parties being captured by people with very nefarious interests, as the honorable was saying. We get people that capture our political parties, and therefore to create a situation where the best thing that can happen once these people once this interests fund you to get into power is you perpetuate the nefarious interests to the detriment of wananchi or citizens. So I think it's important for citizens to take ownership of political processes, be invested, and start holding our politicians accountable at that level. At the party primaries, we don't even have regulations for how party primaries are done in Kenya, or nominations are done, because again, it's a political party affair. It's an elite group of people that does that. So it is high time we then came back and got interested in our political parties, devised an agenda, and perpetuated that agenda, and held our political parties or our politicians that are torchbearers for this agenda, hold them accountable at that level, and we'll begin, I strongly believe, we'll begin to see a change in the way our governments are run. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. We'll now go to Mr. Agenye, your concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. I would want to conclude by saying Africa has Africa is the best continent in the world, if you would allow me to say that. Africa is the best continent in the world. Africa has what it takes to solve its problem. Africa is blessed with the human resources. But what is needed for us to do as African is, how do we optimize this? How do we narrow down our leadership process to address these key issues we have as Africans? How can we work around to hold our leaders accountable? How can we ensure the value of transparency, the value of accountability within the African continent? It's something that we really need to work around. Then I would also want to say that at this point, that we have copy and paste democracy from the Western world. It is time for us to sit back as African to also redefine democracy. It's time for us to redefine democracy and model it to reflect the values that we so hold so dear as Africans. Everything that the white man is giving us as democracy might not be what it is as democracy. We still have countries that are still practicing the monarchical system of government. We know how strong the British Queen, whatever, the royal seats of the British Kingdom. We see how strong it is, how strong influence it has on the entire British political system. Do we also want to start having conversations around redefining African democracy to suit what our values as African, what our culture is as African, what we know, the values we so dear, what we cherish as African, so that we don't copy everything that the white man is giving to us? It makes us slave to them in a way. So we need to reorientate, we need to remodel and redefine our political culture as well to also suit the need of Africans. Then we also need to start speaking to citizens, just like every other person on this platform had also spoken about. We need to start talking to citizens. We need to start talking to the young people. We need to start talking to the women. We need to start talking to everyone that is African, that it's time for us to wake up and take Africa, because we need to create an Africa that is for African. The African dream is not a dream that the white man will help you to actualize it. It is for us African to lead that particular campaign and deliver Africa and ensure that Africa is liberated from the holes of colonialism, of neo-colonialism, and ensure that we have an Africa that is developed for Africans. So at this point, I would say that Africa needs to live for African. Africa need not to be self-centered. Africa needs to subscribe to a value that is people-centered, that is African-centered, and not a value that ensure to enthrone neo-colonialism. So at this point, I'll leave it at this point, and I'll say Asante Sana to ACFIN and every other member of this particular platform for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Asante Sana. Honorable, I will now give you to be the last, since our guest is not on, so you can give us your concluding remarks as we close.
Thank you so much, ACFIN, and those online. The century belongs to Africa. Africa is the emerging economy. If we can fight the balkanization, we have a very big market. We're going to have a very big population, and therefore we could actually deal with all our challenges and benefit from the demographic dividend. So let's do everything to make sure that we make Africa what we want to make it be. Clearly, we are all saying that being in power means a lot. And I am an advocate of national dialogue here in Uganda. Because whereas I'm a pluralist, I don't believe in winner takes all. What is making it a do or die for these procurements and for these elections is because when you are in government, you are the clearinghouse. When you're not in government, you are out. It's not even an African culture that some side of the family is eating when others are not. Can we learn to have some semblance of proportional government? Whether you have 60% and another one has 40%, you are all in government. that will stop it to be a do or die. Because with the winner takes all, the president is a demigod. And I don't want to go into the details of Uganda, where we not necessarily came to power using an election, where there were other means of coming into an election, and the deficit of our political parties anyway. So it is important that we understand that election is supposed to be the best way to present competing ideologies, the best leadership for a country, the issues in leadership, and leadership. If elected leaders are going to come because who has given more money, then you're looking at the policy direction, policy choices. I say here in Uganda, you may end up missing getting the prime de la prime, and you end up with mediocres. Because the moment it becomes a money issue, it is no longer competition and merit. And you're not allowing people to have the choice, informed choice. Because if one party, if a ruling government has all the media, is using the national budget to prepare for its campaign, then what do you expect the opposition to offer if, like in Uganda, they are permanently in opposition for the last 35 years? So these are things we must engage realistically and understand the perspective within which we are talking. So I don't support winner takes all. And I did predict this in Kenya in 2005 in Nairobi at Amref, when the group of the late Kibaki were celebrating, and I told Professor Nyong, where are the other guys of KANU? Where are they now? And you saw what happened in Kenya in 2007 and 2008 with the Kivutu election, when the election could not be accepted. And they went into a national dialogue. And Kenya has since had a very good constitutional amendment, which for me, from a Ugandan point, I admire. You reduce the powers of the president. You reduce, the president doesn't have to appoint everybody. Very many people now in Kenya have to go for competing for posts. And also, the executive doesn't have to be elected. So that you also increase the issue you talked earlier. Where is the bureaucracy? The bureaucracy should be the institution memory. The bureaucracy should not be so partisan. So if the bureaucracy comes from the best on merit and competition, is one way of guaranteeing that the country is going to be run on the right procurement policies and interpret the regulations and look into the other side of the economy of making sure you control the debt, is making sure that you have institutions working for the country. But right now, what happens in a scenario of winner takes all, even the bureaucracy has to do what pleases the ones who are of the eating, because it means even your job is online. So it will affect the public service, the functionality of the public service. It will kill the institutions. You end up with the parliament, which is an extension of the executive, like in my case, and that's how we should fight the issue of money being the makeup of who is the next president, who is the next member of parliament. It is very important that our citizens make choice of who is the best leader in terms of what they present as the solution to the problems of the country, but not the one who financed most the election, because it is increasingly taking that direction. And that's why there is a risk. We have terrorism going on. What if mafias tomorrow and terrorists brought a lot of money on the table? Does it mean they have financed an election? And also we have a case, what I've been talking about earlier. So increasingly, the multinationals, the neocolonialists and the imperialists, whoever they give money, you will get an expensive dam because the guys who are in the government were financed by those who are bringing an expensive dam, which is unaffordable. And it becomes a white elephant. You will get challenges in the education system because you did not get the right people to see what is best for the country. So I want to appreciate ACFIM and all those partners who are trying to make sure that election is the best way to bring about leadership. The other archaic way my government came to power is not a constitutional, should be discouraged. But the moment people give up, I'm ending with a point of confidence of citizens, public confidence in elections. We don't want to have a fatigue for people to lose hope and we start going back to the bush like it was in Uganda in 1985. We would want people to have confidence in an election as the most civilized way of bringing about leadership. But when they come into leadership, they should not look at those who did not win as adversaries, but as alternative government which can bring alternative policies, and they should be working together. The Kenyan case I quoted, Kibaki, the late, may his soul rest in peace, ended up working with Odinga as a prime minister. And that's what I did prophesy in 2005. And I think that's what should work, because you will see the extremism, the fundamentalism, the fanaticism, which is increasingly coming from those who have lost hope in the electoral process. Those who do not expect to win will bring us more militant, more unconstitutional, and more savage ways of politics. Let us do everything possible to make sure that elections work without money, but in merit and competition, and allowing to build the institution. Because it's the good thing with political parties, they are the only institutions which are created by law to contest for power. And that's why we should allow them to recruit, allow them to have clear funding, allow them to have ideological clarity, so that citizens can know the future, can predict with certainty what is this party giving. Of course, we increasingly have, of course, in my case, for us Uganda, we are worried of Kenya election all the time, because we don't know whether we shall have our fuel supply from the port. The moment there is a flu in Kenya, we get problems. So we pray the Kenya election is good. But Kenya is full of alliances. The parties have died. Jubilee today, tomorrow I don't know what. So can we see political parties forming shape? Of course, Kenya is much better off than Uganda. Mine is another case to discuss for my national dialogue. Let us stop winner takes all. Let us promote pluralism, which is good for the whole country. Let us make sure that we promote elections, and elections as the best way to bring leadership in Africa, because issues of democracy, of inclusion, of participation, of entitlement, of tolerance is not about the donors or Europe. These are values which we all espouse, the whole Africa and the whole world. And nobody should say we are being lectured from out. It is good for Africa, it's good for our own country, and we also want to belong to that club. Chogam was just in Rwanda yesterday. If we want to belong to the club of the civilized, we must make sure election is the way to go to bring the leaders for in the interest of our grandchildren. I want to thank you so much and identify with the submission of the police.
Thank you so much, Madam Mustale. Now, on behalf of ACFIM, I want to thank all the panelists for honoring our invitation and participating in this monthly webinar on money in politics. I want to thank all those also who have been following us online. My name is Abel Eseru. This monthly webinar series on money in politics takes place every end of month, every Thursday, every end of Thursday of every month. And the next one will also be next month. Just mark your dates. Every end of month Thursday, we have a monthly webinar talk show on money in politics, which takes place, which runs from 2 p.m. East African time to 4 p.m. East African time. I want to thank you all. It has come to an end. Let's meet again next month at the end of next month. That is last Thursday of the month. Thank you.